I grew up during apartheid, and while I was at university, Nelson Mandela was released from jail, and politically the situation changed quite a lot. So there was that background as I was growing up. And then also on a personal level, my parents were both quite a lot older when I was born, and they often got mistaken for my grandparents, which used to annoy me immensely. But one of the advantages of having older parents was that they had more money to spend on things. And so we were able to travel a lot when I was young and in primary school. And I think that, combined with growing up in apartheid South Africa, just seeing the differences in other countries compared to what it was like in our country, were really stark reminders for me that things could be different and that there's always another way of doing things. And that's something that I carried with me throughout my school career and also at university, was to question the way things are and not to accept them at face value. So after I finished school, I took a gap year and traveled to South America, where I spent some time in Brazil. And then after that year, I came back and went to the University of Cape Town, where I studied a BA degree in English and literature. I want to do something more academic and something more with a professional qualification. I want to do a degree where I can come out and say I'm a this, whereas when you do an English degree, you come out and you can't say I'm a this. So law ticked all the boxes, and the boxes for me then were, I want to be able to say I'm a lawyer. I'd like something that gives me some status. I'd like a professional qualification, and it must be intellectually stimulating, and I'd like to make a lot of money. Now, I went off to do my articles of clerkship, as they're called in South Africa, at a very traditional law firm, and I spent a year there thinking, I don't want to be like those partners. They're very stressed, they're mostly unhappy, they can't leave their job because they've got mortgages to pay and cars that they're paying off and children to put through private school, and they work long, long hours, and I just don't want to be that. And the other thing for me was I felt like I was playing a role that wasn't really me. So in the mornings I would wake up and get dressed and put on my actor's costume, which was a suit and a little case, and go off and play lawyer, and then come home and be me. So I thought, okay, well, I'll go and do some academic work. And Julie went and joined the law faculty at the University of Cape Town and became a lecturer and a tutor, and did some research. And I really enjoyed that, but I still felt very cut off from the world and from people. And I wanted to be out there doing something and making a difference. And so that's when I left being an academic and started my own law firm. And then out of that, I developed to a more integrative way of practicing law, which is what I'm doing at the moment. Milkwood Law is a law firm that I started in South Africa in 2012, and it came about as something to run side by side my own more traditional law firm, in which I practiced conveyancing, wills and probate, and some contractual work, and marriage contracts, prenups. But that law firm didn't seem to meet all my clients' needs. And over the 7 years where I was practicing before Milkwood Law, it became very clear that clients came with a lot more than just legal needs. Many of them came to see me in times of trouble, where they had some kind of problem that needed to be solved. And often the problem, as far as the legal issues, was quite minor, but the distress that it caused the client was much greater. And even with the conveyancing, which was buying and selling property, which is not a problem as such, it created a lot of stress for people, packing up their house and having to move, or being the ones moving in and the date that they were going to move in, and the goalposts kept shifting. People were really stressed a lot of the time. And so I found that people were talking to me a lot about the way that they felt. And then on the wills front, the wills that I drafted, we had to talk about death. And that became quite an emotive conversation sometimes. And we'd have to talk about guardianship and who would look after their children if something were to happen to both of them. And sometimes people would end up crying in the consultation. And I did my best to try and contain those emotions and be compassionate and empathic. But it wasn't my strength, in that I hadn't trained to be a counselor or a psychologist. And I felt that I was really lacking something there. And so out of that came the idea that perhaps a more collaborative law firm would serve clients' needs better. And so I approached a clinical psychologist and a family counselor and shared with them my concerns about the fact that I wasn't able to properly serve clients' needs. And together we came up with the concept for Milkwood Law, which is based on the idea of integrative law, which is where one practices in a more holistic way and not necessarily just from a legal, rational head perspective, and brings into the process emotions and even spiritual aspects depending on the client and what needs to be done. And so I suppose that's how Milkwood Law came about and was born. Initially, Milkwood Law offered 2 separate processes depending on the client's needs. And so if the client came to see us wanting a prenuptial agreement or a cohabitation agreement, then I would meet with them together with the clinical psychologist. So the process would start off, they would approach me and say they're looking for a marriage contract. And then I would say to them, well, would you like to try a more integrative process where we actually use this opportunity where we have to talk about your relationship and your finances and property, to discuss how you're actually going to manage that in your relationship rather than when the relationship ends, because that's really what a prenup is about. It's about what will we do when we separate. And for me, that's just one point in time. And having done some divorce work, it became clear to me that there's so many points in a relationship at which one can change things, but often those changes don't happen, and then the relationship flounders. So if we could give clients tools to use within their relationship, then there would be so much more chance of that relationship being successful. And one example was a couple a gay couple, 2 women, who were going to adopt children, and they were both professionals, and they weren't quite sure who was going to be the one to stay at home and look after the children. And in fact, they thought that they would alternate doing that. And so out of the conversation that we had came an agreement between them that when one of them was working and the other was at home, the one who was working would make payments to the one who was at home's pension fund, so that there was no disparity between their pensions at the end of the day, because they had honored each other's obligations. And that would never have happened in a standard antenuptial contract process, because a lawyer wouldn't have even been interested in that, or that conversation just wouldn't have happened, because they would have focused purely on the legal requirements. So the Milkwood Law process is a very different process to the traditional law firm process. And it took a while for me to reach that stage, because as I started out as a lawyer, I obviously followed what I'd been taught, and that was the traditional process of getting information from someone, using the information that I needed to give them the document or the solution that they needed. And one of the things we were taught at law school was to think like a lawyer and to keep our feelings out of things, because you can't help anyone if you start getting upset about something. So you have to put all your feelings aside and give them a legal solution, and that's the way to assist clients. And so I think a lot of lawyers practice in that way. It's how they're taught in many law schools. It's how legal information is presented in many cases. And there is a definite, what's the right word? A definite weight that's given to being lawyerly and thinking rationally. So in a traditional law firm, if you went to see somebody for a will, you would potentially fill out a question, answer a questionnaire, or they would ask you a series of questions about what your family consists of, how many children do you have, how old are they, what do you want for them if you die before they are 18 years old. Do you own any fixed property? Would you like to leave something to charity? Those kinds of questions. And generally there will be no discussion of how do you feel about this process. Are you able to talk constructively and openly about something that might be really emotive for you? And what has your experience been so far? Because most people have had an experience of someone in their family, a grandparent possibly, or even a parent, or maybe a child who has died, and they've had to deal with the estate process. And so they bring with them their story about how that is and how lawyers are in dealing with that. And so the Milkwood law process would be very different in that it would actually, the starting point would be looking at the client's values, what's really important to them at the end of the day, and how can we bring that into the document that is being created, and how can we honor that so that when something happens, they are brought back to their values, or at least their family are reminded that this is what the person really wanted and this is what mattered to them.